23 feet above the Danube River, First Lieutenant Robert Stetson could see individual stones on the bridge pier rushing toward his B-24 Liberator at 280 miles per hour. His bombardier, Second Lieutenant James Crawford, lay flat in the nose compartment, watching the bridge superstructure grow larger through the Norden bombsight with a mixture of precision and terror. Crawford's hands trembled as he made final adjustments. The altimeter read 75 feet. They were supposed to be at 25,000. Stetson's words, recorded in his mission debriefing 3 hours later, carried the weight of a man who had looked death in the face and found something worse than fear, the absolute certainty that survival depended on perfect execution at impossible altitude. I could see the faces of German soldiers on the bridge. They weren't shooting, they were diving for cover. We were too low, too fast. The flak guns pointed at the sky couldn't depress far, enough to hit us. For the first time in this war, we had the advantage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The date was April 10th, 1944. The target was the Medvedov railway bridge in Yugoslavia, a critical link in German supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. Standard doctrine called for precision bombing from 20,000 to 25,000 feet, where heavy flak and fighter interception made every mission a statistical gamble with death. But the 15th Air Force had tried that approach 17 times against Balkan bridges. The result: 43 aircraft lost, 630 airmen dead or captured, and not a single bridge destroyed. The bridges stood intact, protected by concentrated anti-aircraft batteries that turned the sky above them into a corridor of steel and explosive that no bomber could have survived long enough to aim accurately. Something had to change. The mathematics of high-altitude bridge bombing had proven brutally simple. Bridges were narrow targets requiring precise hits, heavy flak forced evasive action that destroyed bombing accuracy, multiple passes increased losses without guaranteeing success, and replacement bridges could be constructed in weeks. General Nathan Twining, commanding the 15th Air Force, faced a strategic crisis. The bridges spanning the Danube and its tributaries carried 80% of German supplies to Army Group South in the Balkans. Intelligence estimated that destroying just 6 key bridges would cut German logistical capacity by 70%, potentially shortening the war by months. But conventional bombing had failed catastrophically. The solution came from an unlikely source, a pre-war civil engineer named Major John Jack Crampton, who had supervised bridge construction in Montana before the war. Crampton had been shot down over Italy in January 1944, evaded capture, and spent 6 weeks behind enemy lines observing German bridge defences. What he noticed changed everything. The German flak batteries protecting bridges were positioned for high-altitude defence. The famous 88mm guns could elevate to nearly vertical, creating an umbrella of fire above critical targets. But they had a critical limitation: minimum depression angles. The guns physically could not aim lower than approximately 5 to 10 degrees below horizontal. This created a protective zone, a bubble of safety that extended from ground level to roughly 300 feet in altitude, varying by distance from the gun position. Inside this zone, an aircraft was theoretically safe from the very weapons designed to destroy it. Crampton's proposal was radical to the point of seeming suicidal. Approach bridges at masthead height, below the minimum depression angle of German flak, drop bombs with delayed fuses from 50 to 100 feet, and exit the target area in the protected zone before the bombs detonated. The concept violated every principle of heavy bomber doctrine. B-24s were designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, not low-level attack. Their massive size, 67 feet long with a 110-foot wingspan, made them unwieldy at low altitude. A single mistake, a moment's inattention, would send 32 tons of aircraft and 10 men into the ground at 300 miles per hour. The initial response from bomber commanders was predictable rejection. Colonel Leon Johnson, commanding the 44th Bomb Group, listened to Crampton's presentation and responded with professional skepticism tempered by desperation. Major, B-24s don't fly at treetop level. They're strategic bombers, not dive bombers. What you're proposing would require flying straight and level toward a heavily defended target with zero room for evasive action. One hit, at an engine, and we're in the river. Crampton's reply, preserved in the mission planning documents, demonstrated the cold calculus that had begun to dominate American air strategy. Colonel, we've lost 43 aircraft trying to hit these bridges from altitude. That's 430 men. The high-altitude approach isn't working. The flak is too accurate, the target is too narrow, and the Germans rebuild faster than we can destroy. Low-level attack gives us three advantages. We're below the flak depression angle, we're moving too fast for visual tracking, and we're close enough that even a near miss will damage the bridge structure. Yes, it's dangerous, but what we're doing now is simply expensive failure. The debate that followed revealed a fundamental shift occurring in American air doctrine during spring 1944. The romantic notions of daylight precision bombing from high altitude, the strategy that had dominated planning since 1942, was life, colliding with battlefield reality. Bridges, unlike factories or rail yards, were narrow, heavily defended, and quickly repaired. They demanded a different approach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. General Twining made the decision that would validate or condemn Crampton's theory. One mission, one bridge, volunteer crews only. If it worked, the technique would be expanded. If it failed, no one would mention it again. The 44th Bomb Group, known as the Flying Eight Balls, was selected for the experimental mission. Their commander, Colonel Johnson, was a veteran of the Ploiesti oil field raid in August 1943, the lowest and bloodiest mission in American bomber history. If anyone understood the risks and requirements of low-altitude heavy bomber attack, it was Johnson and his crews. Lieutenant Robert Stetson volunteered immediately. His crew had flown 31 missions, losing 2 bombers and 13 friends to flak over Austrian and Romanian targets. The odds of surviving a full 50-mission tour were approximately 1 in 4. Trying something new, even something that appeared suicidal, seemed preferable to continuing the mathematical certainty of high-altitude death. Stetson's bombardier, Lieutenant Crawford, was less enthusiastic. During the pre-mission briefing, he asked the question every man was thinking. "Sir, what happens if the delayed fuses fail? What happens if the bombs explode on impact while we're still over the target?" Major Crampton's answer was honest to the point of brutality. "Then your aircraft and the 2 behind you are destroyed instantly. That's why we're using 11-second delay fuses and attacking in trail formation with 100-yard spacing. The lead aircraft drops, the bombs sink into the water or embed in the bridge structure, and they detonate after all aircraft have cleared the target area." In theory, the theoretical nature of the mission planning became apparent during training flights over the Italian countryside. Flying a B-24 at 50 feet required constant attention and perfect coordination between pilot and co-pilot. The aircraft's controls, designed for high-altitude stability, became hypersensitive near the ground. A slight updraft could lift the bomber suddenly. A moment's distraction could put it into the terrain. The Liberator's high-wing design, advantageous for stability at altitude, created blind spots below that made low-level navigation treacherous. Stetson practiced for 3 days, flying up and down Italian river valleys at progressively lower altitudes. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Michael Reardon, described the experience in a letter to his parents, mailed but never sent, found in his personal effects after his death 6 weeks later. "We're learning to fly the Lib like a fighter plane, which is terrifying because she weighs 16 tons empty and 32 tons loaded. At 50 feet, there's no room for mistakes. You can't pull up if something goes wrong, you're already at minimum altitude. Every second you're watching the instruments, watching the terrain, watching the wings for clearance. It's the most demanding flying I've ever done. And we're going to do it in combat, probably getting shot at, definitely knowing that one mistake kills everyone aboard instantly." The technical challenges multiplied during weapons testing. Standard 500-pound general-purpose bombs, dropped from 50 feet, would detonate on impact with enough force to damage or destroy the dropping aircraft. The solution required modified ordnance, bombs fitted with 11-second delay fuses, allowing time for the aircraft to clear the target area before detonation, and reinforced nose caps to survive impact with water or bridge structure without breaking apart before the delayed fuse functioned. The weaponeers faced an additional complication that seemed minor but proved critical. Calculating the precise trajectory of bombs dropped at near-zero altitude and high speed. Traditional bombing tables assumed release altitudes above 10,000 feet, where gravity and air resistance dominated trajectory calculations. At 50 feet and 280 miles per hour, forward velocity became the primary factor. The bombs would travel almost horizontally for the first second after release, following the aircraft's flight path before gravity asserted dominance. This meant bombardiers had to aim not at the bridge, but at a point in the water approximately 200 feet before the bridge, allowing the bombs to skip like stones and strike the underwater pilings with maximum force. Lieutenant Crawford spent hours studying the modified bombing tables, trying to internalize calculations that contradicted every instinct developed during 31 previous missions. At altitude, you compensate for gravity and wind, he explained to his crew. Down low, you're essentially throwing bombs horizontally and hoping they hit before they sink. The margin for error is about 3 seconds of flight time. Too early and we hit the water short of the bridge. Too late and we hit the bridge deck instead of the pilings, probably bouncing the bombs over the target entirely. And I have to make this calculation while flying straight toward a target at 50 feet with no room for course correction. The human factors worried medical officers more than the technical challenges. Flying at high altitude was physically and psychologically demanding, but it offered one crucial advantage: distance from the enemy. At 25,000 feet, anti-aircraft fire appeared as small, black puffs, abstract and impersonal. German fighters were adversaries, but not immediately visible threats. The war happened at a remove that allowed mental compartmentalization. Low-altitude attack eliminated that protective distance. At 50 feet, pilots could see individual soldiers, identify vehicle types, watch people running for cover. The war became intensely personal and immediate. Psychological screening of volunteer crews focused on one question: could these men fly directly toward a target, knowing they would see the faces of people trying to kill them, with no ability to evade or take cover? Captain Thomas Warren, the squadron flight surgeon, interviewed each volunteer crew member. His notes, discovered in National Archives records in 1997, revealed the complexity of aerial warfare psychology. The high-altitude crews deal with abstract danger. They know intellectually that flak can kill them, but they rarely see the source. Low-altitude crews will see everything: the guns, the gunners, the terrain, the target. Some men can compartmentalize this immediate threat and maintain focus. Others will freeze or panic. We're trying to predict human behavior under stress that few people have ever experienced. Lieutenant Stetson passed the psychological screening, but Captain Warren noted concerns about the pilot's co-pilot, Lieutenant Reardon. Reardon is technically proficient, but demonstrates anxiety responses during simulated low-altitude flight. He fixates on obstacles, shows tunnel vision under stress. He may struggle during the actual mission. However, Stetson vouches for him, and crew cohesion is critical, approved with reservations. The final mission briefing occurred on April 9, 1944. 12 B-24 crews crowded into the operations building at Benina Airfield in Libya. Colonel Johnson stood before a covered map board, his expression revealing nothing. When he pulled back the cover, the groans were audible. The target map showed the Medvedov railway bridge spanning the Danube in Yugoslavia, surrounded by known anti-aircraft positions marked with concentric circles, indicating range and lethality. Johnson's briefing was characteristically blunt. You volunteered for this mission, which means you're either brave or stupid. Probably both. Here's what we know. The Medvedov bridge is defended by at least 12 heavy flak batteries, probably more. Intelligence says they have 88s, 105s, and multiple 20mm and 37mm automatic weapons. At altitude, this target is suicide. We've tried, 17 times, 43 aircraft lost, 0 bridges destroyed. We're trying something different. You'll approach the target at 50 feet, below the minimum depression angle of the heavy flak. You'll drop 1,000-pound bombs with 11-second delay fuses aimed at the bridge pilings. You'll egress at minimum altitude, following the river course to maintain the protective zone until you're out of range. In theory, the flak can't touch you. In theory. The emphasis on theory was not reassuring. Someone asked the obvious question. What about small arms fire, Colonel? At 50 feet, every German soldier with a rifle can shoot at us. Johnson nodded. Yes, and that's a calculated risk. Small arms fire can damage aircraft but rarely brings down a heavy bomber immediately. Heavy flak destroys bombers instantly. We're trading one threat for another. You'll be moving at 280 miles per hour, which gives rifle fire approximately 2 seconds of tracking time. It's a risk, but better than certain death from flak. The formation structure added another layer of complexity. Unlike high-altitude missions where bombers flew in defensive boxes with overlapping fields of fire, the low-altitude attack required single-file approach in trail formation. Each aircraft would follow the path of the one ahead, separated by approximately 100 yards. This meant the lead aircraft faced the most danger fully alert defenses, no suppression from previous attacks. Each subsequent aircraft theoretically benefited from German confusion and defensive disorganization. Lieutenant Stetson's crew drew the third position in the formation. Not the most dangerous lead position, but far from the relative safety of trailing aircraft. The mission commander, Major John Brooks, would fly lead. If his approach proved successful, others would follow. If he failed, the mission would abort. The weight of the entire experimental doctrine rested on one crew, one pilot, one approach. That night, Stetson wrote a letter to his wife in Minnesota. The letter, preserved in his personal papers, revealed the complicated emotions of a man preparing for a mission that contradicted everything he had learned about survival. Dearest Margaret, tomorrow we're trying something new. I can't tell you what, but it's different from anything we've done before. The other men are worried, and honestly, so am I. But I keep thinking about the boys we've lost on regular missions. Smithson's crew last week, Patterson's crew the week before. The way we're fighting now isn't working. Maybe this new approach will save and lives in the long run. Or maybe I'm rationalizing because I'm scared and need to believe there's a reason for the risk. I keep picturing the bridge we're supposed to hit. In my mind, it's the railroad bridge over the Mississippi near Red Wing, the one we used to fish from when we were kids. I imagine flying toward it at 50 feet, so low I could see the grain in the wood planking. Then I remember it's not that bridge, it's a German bridge, and there will be people shooting at us, and I have to fly straight at them without flinching. I don't know if I can do that. I hope I can. The crew is counting on me. If you receive this letter, it means something went wrong tomorrow. Know that I loved you every day of my life, and that whatever happened, I was trying to do something that mattered. The morning of April 10th, 1944 arrived with clear skies over Libya, conditions that bomber crews normally welcomed but today viewed with apprehension. Clear weather meant perfect visibility for German gunners. Major John Brooks gathered his lead crew at 0400 hours, 2 hours before scheduled takeoff. His words, recalled by surviving crew members in post-war interviews, established the tone for what would become one of the most unusual missions in American bombing history. We're writing the manual today. Everything we do, every decision we make, will determine whether this technique lives or dies. If we succeed, we save lives by proving there's a better way to hit these bridges. If we fail, we're just another statistic, and the Air Force goes back to losing 40 aircraft per target. No pressure. The 12 B-24 Liberators lifted off from Benina at 06:15 hours, formed up over the Mediterranean, and turned northeast toward Yugoslavia. The flight to the initial point would take 3 hours and 40 minutes, during which crews had nothing to do but contemplate what waited at the end. Unlike high-altitude missions, where the climb operational altitude consumed the first hour and occupied crew attention, this mission maintained 12,000 feet until the final approach. Pilots and co-pilots had too much time to think. Lieutenant Stetson used the transit time to review emergency procedures with his crew. At 50 feet altitude, standard emergency protocols became irrelevant. An engine fire couldn't be extinguished by diving; they were already at minimum altitude. A control surface failure couldn't be compensated by altitude trade-offs. Any serious damage meant immediate forced landing or ditching, assuming the pilot maintained control long enough to find suitable terrain. Technical Sergeant Harold Mitchell, the flight engineer, understood the mathematics better than anyone aboard. He had calculated fuel consumption, weight distribution, and performance margins for every phase of the mission. His assessment, shared with the crew over the interphone system, was characteristically blunt. At our attack weight of 60,000 pounds, with full fuel and 2,000 pounds of ordnance, we need every inch of available power to maintain level flight at 50 feet. If we lose one engine, we can probably maintain altitude. If we lose two engines on the same side, we're going down immediately. There's no altitude to trade for airspeed, no room to maneuver. We'll have about 3 seconds from engine failure to ground impact. So, let's not lose any engines. The IP initial point, where the formation would descend to attack altitude, lay 20 miles west of the target. Major Brooks led the formation down from 12,000 feet in a gentle descent that became progressively steeper as they approached the Danube River. At 5,000 feet, the Yugoslavian countryside became individualized. Specific buildings, identifiable roads, visible people. At 1,000 feet, the sensation of speed intensified dramatically. The ground blurred past, reference points appearing and vanishing in seconds. At 200 feet, several pilots reported vertigo, the optical illusion that they were flying slower than actual airspeed because they had never experienced terrain passage at this altitude and speed. At 50 feet, reality became intensely concentrated. Lieutenant Reardon, Stetson's co-pilot, described the experience in his personal diary, written that evening in a shaking hand that betrayed the day's stress. Descending to 50 feet was like entering a different kind of flying. Everything became immediate and personal. I could see laundry hanging in farmhouse yards. I could see people in fields looking up at us. I could see individual trees, individual fence posts, individual stones in the riverbeds we followed. The altimeter became the most important instrument, and I found myself fixating on it, watching it constantly, terrified that we might descend below 50 feet and strike terrain we couldn't see fast enough to avoid. Stetson had to tell me twice to watch outside, to stop fixating on the instruments. He was right, but breaking that fixation was the hardest thing I've done. The formation followed the Danube River's course, using the water as a natural navigation corridor and protective terrain feature. Flying between the riverbanks, with trees and low hills on either side, provided some concealment from distant observation, but it also created a psychological cage. The Liberators were massive aircraft, and at 50 feet they seemed to fill the entire river valley. Wingtips cleared the tree line by what appeared to be feet, though actual clearance was probably 20 to 30 feet. The sensation was of threading a needle while travelling at 460 feet per second. 10 miles from the target, Major Brooks transmitted the mission code, "Madhouse is running." The formation was committed. There would be no abort unless mechanical failure forced individual aircraft to turn back. The attack would proceed regardless of defences encountered, regardless of casualties, regardless of outcome. The experimental doctrine demanded conclusive results, success or failure measured in binary terms. Bridge destroyed or bridge standing. 6 miles from target, the German defenders detected the approaching formation. Radio intercepts, decoded after the war, revealed the confusion in German defensive coordination. Flak battery commander Hauptmann Friedrich Weiss initially reported the sighting as low-flying fighters, unable to conceive that 4-engine heavy bombers would approach at treetop level. His correction, not fighters, American heavy bombers at minimum altitude, triggered emergency defensive procedures that proved completely inadequate. The 88mm guns began traversing downward, seeking targets below their normal engagement envelope. Gunners discovered what Major Crampton had predicted. The weapons physically could not depress far enough to engage targets at 50 feet altitude and rapidly decreasing range. The heavy Flak, Germany's most effective anti-aircraft weapon, was useless against this attack profile. 4 miles from target, the German defenders opened fire with every weapon that could engage low-altitude targets. 20mm and 37mm automatic cannon, designed for close-range defense against fighters, began throwing streams of explosive shells toward the approaching bombers. These weapons, unlike the heavy Flak, could depress to ground level and tracked targets effectively at close range. The Americans had traded one threat for another, gambling that rapid closure speed and the difficulty of tracking large, fast-moving targets at low altitude would offset the increased number of weapons engaging them. Tracer fire, visible even in daylight, arced toward Major Brooks's lead aircraft. The stream of projectiles appeared to move slowly at first, a visual illusion created by distance and perspective. As the shells approached, their actual velocity became apparent. They flashed past the bomber's nose in streaks of light, some passing within feet of the cockpit. Technical Sergeant William Cook, Brooks's top turret gunner, later testified that he watched tracers pass between the bomber's engines and fuselage, so close that he involuntarily ducked despite being inside an armoured turret. Staff Sergeant Robert Davison, flying as tail gunner in Brooks's aircraft, had the most terrifying view of the approach. Facing backward, he watched the 2 bombers following Brooks' aircraft fly directly into the defensive fire that his own aircraft had just passed through. He could see the German gun positions clearly, could identify individual gunners operating their weapons, could watch the muzzle flashes that marked each burst of fire. His interphone commentary, recorded on the mission voice recorder for training purposes, provided a real-time account of low-altitude combat. Jesus, they're shooting everything they have. I can see the guns, must be. 20 positions, all firing. Stetson's bird just took hits. I saw the strikes on his left wing. He's still flying. The number 4 bird is taking fire. Heavy fire. Pieces coming off his tail. He's still in formation. We're almost there. Brooks is holding steady. I can see the bridge now. It's huge. It's right there. Brooks is dropping. Bombs away from lead. Stetson's dropping. Number 4's dropping. We're past, and I can see the bridge behind us, and we're all still flying. The bomb release sequence occurred in less than 5 seconds, but required precise coordination developed through days of practice. As each aircraft reached the calculated release point approximately 200 feet before the bridge, the bombardier toggled the bomb release. 2,000-pound bombs fell from the belly of each aircraft, traveling forward at 280 miles per hour, while simultaneously beginning to arc downward under gravity. The bombs struck the water in a cascade of enormous splashes, some skipping once before sinking toward the underwater bridge pilings, others embedding directly into the riverbed or striking the stone foundations with audible impacts that resonated through the aircraft structures. The 11-second delay fuses began their countdown the instant each bomb struck. The attacking aircraft, travelling at 460 feet per second, covered over 5,000 feet in those 11 seconds. Major Brooks's lead aircraft was climbing away from the river valley when the first series of detonations erupted behind him. The underwater explosions created massive columns of water mixed with debris that rose 200 feet into the air. The shock waves propagated through the water, striking the bridge pilings with hydraulic ram force equivalent to hundreds of tons of pressure concentrated in milliseconds. Stone and concrete, seemingly solid and indestructible, shattered under the pressure. The ancient pilings, which had supported the bridge since its construction in 1887, fractured at their bases. For a moment, nothing visible changed. The bridge stood intact, seemingly undamaged despite the enormous explosions around its foundation. Then, slowly at first, then with accelerating catastrophe, the central span began to sag. The stone arch, unsupported by its compromised pilings, could no longer bear its own weight. With a grinding roar audible 5 miles away, 300 feet of railway bridge collapsed into the Danube in a cloud of pulverized stone and twisted steel. Lieutenant Stetson, climbing away from the target in formation with Brooks' aircraft, turned to look back at the destruction. His first thought, which he later described as absurd given the circumstances, was that Major Crampton had been right. The low-altitude attack had worked exactly as theorized. The bridge was destroyed, 12 aircraft had survived the attack, and the technique had been validated with the most convincing proof possible: success without catastrophic losses. His second thought, arriving immediately after the first, was that his aircraft was losing hydraulic pressure. The German 20mm cannon fire that Sergeant Davison had reported seeing strike Stetson's left wing had severed a hydraulic line. The Liberator's landing gear, flaps, and brake systems all depended on hydraulic pressure. Without it, they would have to manually extend the landing gear and make an emergency landing without flaps or brakes. Technical Sergeant Mitchell diagnosed the problem within minutes. Hydraulic line severed, probably by cannon fire. We're losing fluid fast. I can manually pump pressure to extend the gear for landing, but we'll have one chance. Once we extend the gear, we won't have pressure to retract it if we need to abort the landing, and we'll have no brakes. We'll be landing hot with no way to stop except running off the end of the runway or ground looping to scrub off speed. Stetson made the decision that demonstrated why he had been selected for this mission. We're heading home. We'll deal with the landing when we get there. Right now, let's make sure we get there. The return flight to Libya required 3 hours and 20 minutes, during which Stetson and his crew prepared for an emergency landing that would require precision they had never practiced. Landing a B-24 without flaps meant approaching at higher speed. Landing without brakes meant being unable to stop on a normal runway length. Combining both factors meant they would touch down at approximately 120 miles per hour and roll for nearly a mile before friction and drag slowed them to a stop. The mathematics worked in theory, assuming perfect execution and runway conditions. Any error, any miscalculation, would result in the aircraft departing the runway at high speed and almost certainly breaking apart. Staff Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez, the radio operator, transmitted their situation to Benina Airfield while still 1 hour from landing. The tower cleared emergency equipment to stand by and routed other traffic away from Stetson's approach path. The entire airfield would be dedicated to getting one damaged bomber safely on the ground. Colonel Johnson positioned himself in the control tower with binoculars, watching the returning formation materialize as dots on the horizon that slowly resolved into individual aircraft. 11 Liberators, in proper formation, one aircraft trailing slightly, flying lower than the others, Stetson's aircraft. The landing approach required concentration that transcended normal flying discipline. Stetson flew the pattern manually. No autopilot, no assistance, just hands-on control coordinated with his co-pilot calling out airspeed and altitude. They crossed the runway threshold at 115 miles per hour, 15 miles per hour faster than normal approach speed. The main wheels touched the concrete with a screech of rubber, the aircraft bouncing once before settling firmly onto the runway. Without flaps to create drag, the Liberator continued rolling at highway speed. Without brakes to slow the roll, momentum carried them forward inexorably. At the halfway point of the runway, they were still travelling at 80 miles per hour. At the three-quarter mark, 60 miles per hour. The end of the runway approached rapidly. Mitchell called out the remaining distance. 500 feet, 400, 300, 200, 100. At 50 feet from the runway's end, the bomber slowed to 20 miles per hour and stopped. Stetson and Reardon sat motionless for 10 seconds, hands still on the controls, neither speaking. Then Stetson keyed the interphone. "Everybody okay?" 9 crew members reported affirmative. They had survived the mission and the landing. They had proven that low-altitude bridge attack was possible, and they had demonstrated something perhaps more important, that innovation driven by necessity could overcome defensive advantages that seemed insurmountable. The mission debriefing lasted 4 hours as intelligence officers documented every detail of the attack profile, defensive reactions, bombing accuracy, and damage assessment. Reconnaissance photographs, taken by a high-altitude P-38 photo bird 1 hour after the attack, showed the Medvedov Bridge's central span completely destroyed and blocking the Danube shipping channel. German railway traffic that had moved across the bridge for 57 years would now detour 200 miles to the next crossing point. Major Crampton, who had proposed the low-altitude technique, attended the debriefing and listened to crew testimonies with professional satisfaction, tempered by awareness of what this success meant. His theoretical doctrine had become operational reality, which meant more crews would fly more missions using this technique. Some would succeed, some would fail. All would face the risks that Stetson's crew had just survived. Colonel Johnson's assessment, recorded in the official mission report, captured the complex implications of the Medvedov bridge attack. The mission achieved complete success with acceptable losses: 0 aircraft destroyed, 1 aircraft damaged, 0 casualties. The low-altitude approach negated heavy flak defenses, as predicted. Light automatic weapons fire, while intense, proved less lethal than anticipated. The key factors in mission success were precise navigation, disciplined formation flying, accurate bombing by all bombardiers, and excellent crew coordination. This technique is operationally viable for bridge targets that cannot be effectively engaged from altitude. However, it requires extensive crew training, optimal weather conditions, precise intelligence on target defenses, and acceptance of different risk factors compared to high-altitude bombing. Recommended for expansion to other groups with appropriate training pipeline development. Within 2 weeks, the 15th Air Force established a low-altitude bridge attack training program. Within 6 weeks, 3 more bomb groups qualified in the technique. Within 3 months, Allied forces had destroyed 23 strategic bridges in the Balkans using variations of the Medvedov approach. The cumulative effect on German logistics was catastrophic. By June 1944, when the Normandy invasion required maximum German commitment in France, Army Group South in the Balkans was receiving only 30% of required supplies. Divisions that should have been transferred to France remained in Yugoslavia and Greece, immobilized by lack of fuel, ammunition, and food, all because bridges that once seemed indestructible had been destroyed by bombers flying at altitudes where the most sophisticated air defenses couldn't reach them. Lieutenant Stetson and his crew flew 7 more low-altitude bridge missions before completing their combat tour in July 1944. They destroyed 5 bridges, damaged 2 others, and returned safely from every mission. Stetson was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for the Medvedov mission, though he insisted the decoration belonged to his entire crew, especially Technical Sergeant Mitchell, whose emergency hydraulic work had made their survival possible. In his acceptance speech at the medal ceremony, Stetson said something that captured the essence of why the low-altitude technique succeeded despite its apparent risks. "We didn't win because we were braver than the men who attacked from altitude. We won because someone looked at an impossible problem and found a weakness in what seemed like perfect defenses. The Germans built their defenses to stop high-altitude bombers because that's how we'd always attacked. When we changed our approach, their defenses became irrelevant. The lesson isn't about flying low. The lesson is about questioning assumptions and finding new solutions when old methods stop working. That's how you win wars. That's how you stay alive." The success of the Medvedov Bridge mission created immediate demand for expansion of low-altitude attack doctrine across the Mediterranean theatre. By May 1944, the 15th Air Force had designated 4 bomb groups for specialized low-altitude training, with plans to qualify 8 more by August. But the expansion revealed a troubling reality that Major Crampton had anticipated, but military planners had underestimated. Not every crew could execute low-altitude attacks successfully, and the difference between success and catastrophe often came down to psychological factors that no amount of technical training could predict or remedy. The first indication of these limitations came during a mission against the Sobe railway bridge in Hungary on May 3, 1944. The 98th Bomb Group, newly qualified in low-altitude technique, launched 18 aircraft in a coordinated attack similar to the Medvedov profile. The lead aircraft, piloted by Captain Richard Morrison, approached the target at prescribed 50-foot altitude, maintained formation discipline, and successfully dropped ordnance on target. The second aircraft, flown by First Lieutenant David Kellerman, followed Morrison's path exactly as briefed. The third aircraft, piloted by First Lieutenant Charles Hammond, deviated from the planned approach at the last moment. Hammond's co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Pierce, survived the subsequent crash and provided testimony during the accident investigation that revealed the human dimension of low-altitude combat. We were in perfect position behind Kellerman's aircraft. I was calling out altitude 50 feet, airspeed 270, right on target parameters. Then, at maybe 500 yards from the bridge, Hammond suddenly pulled up. Not a gentle climb, a hard pull that put us through 60 degrees nose-up attitude. I didn't understand what was happening. I thought maybe he'd seen something, some obstacle or threat I'd missed. I grabbed the controls to help him, thinking we were avoiding a collision. But there was nothing there. He was just pulling up, pulling hard, and I could hear him breathing fast over the interphone, almost hyperventilating. We climbed through 300 feet, then 500, and suddenly we were in the heavy flak envelope. I saw the muzzle flashes from the 88 batteries, and I knew we were dead. The first shell took off our left wing at the root. We rolled inverted and went straight in. I don't remember the impact. I woke up in a German field hospital with a broken back and burns over 40% of my body. 4 of our crew died instantly. 3 more died of injuries. Hammond and I survived, but I still don't know why he pulled up. He never regained consciousness to explain. The accident investigation, conducted by Colonel Leon Johnson personally, uncovered a pattern that would repeat throughout the expansion of low-altitude operations. Captain Morrison's mission recorder had captured Hammond's radio transmission immediately before his fatal climb. "I can't do it. I can't fly into that. I'm pulling up." The words revealed what flight surgeons had feared, that some pilots, regardless of skill or courage, simply could not maintain the psychological discipline required to fly directly toward a heavily defended target at an altitude that eliminated every instinctive escape option. Hammond had passed all training requirements, demonstrated technical proficiency during practice missions, and shown no signs of psychological unsuitability. Yet, in the moment of combat, when the bridge loomed ahead and defensive fire converged on his approach path, his survival instinct overrode his training, and he sought altitude, the traditional refuge of bomber pilots facing danger. The altitude that killed him. Colonel Johnson's accident report included a paragraph that became foundational to low-altitude attack doctrine and influenced crew selection for the remainder of the war. Low-altitude attack requires psychological characteristics distinct from those needed for high-altitude bombing. High-altitude crews must endure prolonged exposure to danger while maintaining formation discipline. Low-altitude crews must suppress instinctive self-preservation responses while executing precise maneuvers with zero error margin. These are different psychological demands requiring different personality types. Not all pilots possess the specific combination of characteristics needed for low-altitude work. This is not a reflection on courage or competence. It is recognition that different missions require different human capabilities. Selection and training must account for these differences, or we will continue losing crews to psychological factors rather than enemy action. The screening process that emerged from Hammond's death and similar incidents focused on identifying pilots who demonstrated what psychologists termed threat approach behavior, the ability to fly directly toward perceived danger without instinctive evasion responses. The testing methodology was crude by later standards, but effective within the limitations of wartime psychology. Pilots underwent simulated low-altitude approaches using film projection systems that showed increasingly threatening scenarios. Obstacles appearing suddenly in the flight path, simulated defensive fire converging on the aircraft, bridge structures growing rapidly in the visual field. Observers monitored each pilot's control inputs, looking for the telltale pull-up or turn-away responses that indicated instinctive threat avoidance. Approximately 30% of pilots tested showed immediate disqualifying responses. Another 20% showed borderline reactions requiring additional training and testing. Only 50% demonstrated consistent threat approach behavior suitable for low-altitude combat operations without additional conditioning. These statistics, initially classified but declassified in 1973, revealed an uncomfortable truth about human performance in extreme conditions that courage and skill, while necessary, were not sufficient. Some fundamental aspect of personality or neurological wiring determined whether a pilot could execute low-altitude attacks reliably. The Air Force could train technical skills but could not train instinct. Meanwhile, the crews who possessed the right psychological profile continued flying missions that pushed the boundaries of what heavy bombers could accomplish. The technique evolved beyond simple bridge attacks to include other targets that traditional high-altitude bombing had failed to destroy effectively. Viaducts in mountainous terrain where surrounding peaks limited bombing approach angles, railroad tunnels where only direct hits on portal structures caused meaningful damage, dam structures requiring underwater detonations against foundation elements, communication towers, and power transmission systems, requiring precision beyond high-altitude capability. First Lieutenant James Cutler, who flew 23 low-altitude missions with the 44th Bomb Group, described the evolution of technique in his post-war memoir published in 1952. We started with the basic bridge attack straight approach, level flight, bombs away, straight departure, but as we gained experience, we started adapting the technique to different targets. For mountain viaducts, we'd approach from below the target altitude, climbing at the last second to clear the structure while dropping bombs that arced upward before falling onto the viaduct deck. For tunnel portals, we'd use skip bombing technique, where bombs bounced off the ground or water and struck the target horizontally. For dams, we'd drop from higher altitude, maybe 200 feet instead of 50, to give bombs time to and penetrate deep into the water before detonating against the dam foundation. Each target type required different approach geometry, different release parameters, different escape maneuvers. We became specialists in flying bombers like they were dive bombers or torpedo planes. The B-24 wasn't designed for this kind of flying, but we made it work because the alternative was continuing to lose crews on high-altitude missions that weren't destroying the targets anyway. The adaptation of technique to diverse target types created corresponding evolution in German defensive tactics. By June 1944, German anti-aircraft units began repositioning light automatic weapons to cover low-altitude approaches to critical targets. Instead of relying solely on heavy flak pointing skyward, defenses now included machine gun nests and 20mm cannon positions placed at ground level with clear fields of fire along likely approach corridors. This counter-adaptation forced American planners to develop counter-counter tactics. If Germans defended low-altitude approaches, attackers would use terrain masking, approaching targets from directions blocked from defensive observation by hills, forests, or buildings until the last possible moment. If Germans positioned defenses to cover all approach directions, attackers would use weather clouds, fog, rain, to conceal their approach until visual acquisition made evasion impossible. The tactical evolution became a deadly chess game played at 300 miles per hour with human lives as the stakes. Captain Robert Wilson, an intelligence officer assigned to analyze low-altitude attack results, documented the evolving tactical situation in monthly reports that traced the action-reaction cycle between attackers and defenders. His July 1944 report noted a disturbing trend. German defenses are adapting faster than our tactics are evolving. Initial low-altitude attacks achieved surprise and consequently suffered minimal losses. Current attacks face prepared defenses specifically organized to counter low-altitude approach. Loss rates have increased from 2% in April to 7% in June. This remains lower than high-altitude loss rates against the same target types, approximately 15%, but the trend is unfavorable. Without continued tactical innovation, low-altitude attack will become as costly as the high-altitude approach it was designed to replace. The innovation came from unexpected sources, often from crew members who observed defensive patterns and devised countermeasures during actual missions. Technical Sergeant Paul Hendricks, a top turret gunner with the 98th Bomb Group, noticed that German defensive positions near bridges typically focused their attention on the bridge itself and the immediate approach corridor. The area adjacent to the approach path, perpendicular to the expected attack direction, often had lighter defenses. or blind spots. Hendricks proposed a modified attack geometry. Instead of approaching bridges along the river course parallel to the bridge alignment, approach perpendicular to the river, dropping bombs that would strike the water and bridge structure from the side. This cross-river approach offered several advantages. It reduced exposure time in the defensive envelope. It presented a smaller target profile to defensive gunners, tracking aircraft movement. It allowed attacks on bridge spans rather than pilings, sometimes easier to destroy with equivalent ordnance, and it confused German defensive planning organized around traditional approach assumptions. The first cross-river attack occurred on July 18, 1944, against the Novi Sad railway bridge in Yugoslavia. 8 B-24s approached from the southeast, perpendicular to the Danube's flow, each aircraft crossing the river in 3 seconds at 50 feet altitude, while dropping 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the bridge's central arch. 7 aircraft successfully delivered ordnance and departed the target area with minor damage. 1 aircraft, piloted by 2nd Lieutenant Frank Morrison, struck a concealed steel cable stretched across the river as part of a low-altitude defense barrier. The cable severed the aircraft's right horizontal stabilizer, sending the Liberator into an uncontrollable roll that ended with impact into the riverbank. 8 crew members died instantly. 2 survived the crash but were captured and spent the remainder of the war in prisoner camps. The success of the 7 surviving aircraft they destroyed the bridge completely validated the cross-river approach tactically, while highlighting its dangers operationally. The steel cable defense, previously unknown to American intelligence, represented German innovation matching American tactical creativity. Within weeks, reports indicated similar cable barriers protecting bridges throughout the Balkans and Hungary. The defenses were invisible from altitude, nearly impossible to detect during low-level approach, and absolutely lethal to aircraft that struck them at high speed. Major Crampton, who had originated the low-altitude concept, found himself developing countermeasures to defenses specifically designed to defeat his own technique. His solution demonstrated the kind of lateral thinking that characterized American tactical adaptation throughout the war. If cable barriers were invisible and deadly, don't try to detect them, simply attack from altitudes above the maximum height of any practical cable defense. Analysis indicated that cables stretched across rivers could not exceed approximately 200 feet in height due to structural and tension limitations. Attacking from 300 feet altitude would clear any cable barrier, while remaining below the effective engagement envelope of heavy flak. The 300-foot attack profile required recalculation of bombing parameters and acceptance of slightly reduced accuracy compared to 50-foot attacks. But it offered a crucial advantage: survivability against an expanding array of low-altitude defenses. By August 1944, 300-foot attacks had become standard doctrine for targets known or suspected to have cable defenses, while 50-foot attacks continued against targets where such defenses were absent or impractical. The cumulative effect of bridge destruction campaigns using low-altitude technique manifested in strategic results that validated the risks crews had accepted. By September 1944, the German railway system in the Balkans had virtually ceased functioning as an integrated network. Of 43 major bridges that had carried rail traffic in January 1944, only 7 remained operational. The others had been destroyed by low-altitude attack, with reconstruction impossible due to continued Allied air superiority and material shortages. German Army Group E in Greece and Army Group F in Yugoslavia, comprising 21 divisions, received less than 20% of required supplies through the surviving rail connections and inadequate road network. Fuel shortages immobilized armor units. Ammunition rationing limited artillery fire. Food scarcity reduced combat effectiveness and increased desertion rates. The strategic impact exceeded the tactical investment. The 15th Air Force had lost 32 aircraft and 320 crew members in low-altitude bridge attacks between April and September 1944. These losses, while significant, were less than half the casualties that would have resulted from attempting equivalent destruction using high-altitude bombing techniques. More importantly, the destroyed bridges represented infrastructure requiring months or years to rebuild, using resources Germany increasingly lacked as the war progressed. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Dooley, who assumed command of the Pallas 44th Bomb Group in August 1944, articulated the strategic calculus in a speech to new crews beginning low-altitude training. "We're not flying these missions to prove we're brave or to test new techniques for academic interest. We're flying them because they work." High-altitude bridge bombing produced 0 destroyed bridges at a cost of 43 aircraft and 430 men over 6 months. Low-altitude attacks have destroyed 36 bridges at a cost of 32 aircraft and 320 men over 5 months. The mathematics are undeniable. More bridges destroyed, fewer casualties, strategic results that are shortening the war. Yes, flying at 50 feet toward a defended target is terrifying. Yes, every mission carries significant risk, but the alternative continuing high-altitude attacks that don't work would produce higher casualties and fewer results. We're doing this because it's the most effective option available, not because it's easy or safe. Effective matters more than easy. The personal stories of crews who flew these missions reveal the human dimension behind the strategic statistics. First Lieutenant Edward Parker completed 31 low-altitude missions before his aircraft was destroyed by defensive fire over the Dunaferdevar Bridge in Hungary on October 9, 1944. His final letter to his parents, written the night before his death, expressed the complex emotions of men who understood the risks, but accepted them because the alternative seemed worse. "Tomorrow we're hitting another bridge, our 32nd mission if we survive, which would complete our tour and send us home. I know you're praying we make it, and I appreciate that more than I can say. But I want you to understand something, if tomorrow goes badly. We're doing important work here. The bridges we've destroyed have saved Allied lives by cutting German supply lines. Intelligence estimates that our squadron alone has prevented approximately 5,000 tons of German ammunition from reaching frontline units. That's ammunition that won't kill American soldiers in France or Italy. If I die tomorrow, I die knowing that my death served a purpose beyond just following orders. The missions are dangerous, yes, but they matter. That makes the danger bearable." Parker's aircraft was hit by 37mm fire during the bomb run, severing control cables and causing immediate loss of directional control. The Liberator rolled inverted and struck the Danube at over 200 miles per hour. None of the crew survived, but the bridge they had attacked was destroyed, one of 12 bridges eliminated that week in a coordinated campaign that severed German logistics throughout southern Hungary. Parker and his crew became 320th through 329th casualties of low-altitude bridge warfare, but their sacrifice contributed to strategic objectives that helped end the war months earlier than it might otherwise have concluded. By November 1944, the tactical and strategic lessons of low-altitude bridge attack had been documented in operational manuals, training curricula, and after-action analyses that would influence air warfare doctrine for decades. The fundamental insight that aircraft flying below minimum depression angles of heavy anti-aircraft weapons occupied a tactical sanctuary where conventional defenses couldn't reach them became incorporated into attack planning for every subsequent conflict. Modern precision-guided munitions and standoff weapons have made low-altitude bombing largely obsolete. But the conceptual framework established in 1944 remains relevant. Find the gaps in enemy defenses. Exploit those gaps with techniques the enemy hasn't prepared to counter. Adapt faster than the enemy can respond. The crews who flew these missions between April and November 1944 demonstrated something beyond technical skill or personal courage. They proved that innovation driven by operational necessity could overcome defensive advantages that appeared insurmountable. They showed that questioning fundamental assumptions, like the doctrine that heavy bombers must attack from high altitude, could reveal solutions invisible to conventional thinking, and they established that accepting calculated risks, when those risks produced better results than supposedly safer alternatives, represented sound strategic judgment rather than reckless bravado. Lieutenant Stetson returned to the United States in August 1944 after completing 50 combat missions, 12 of them at low altitude against bridge targets. He survived the war, returned to Minnesota, and lived until 1998. In interviews conducted during the 1980s and 1990s, he reflected on the low-altitude missions with perspective earned through 5 decades of distance from events. People ask if I was scared during those missions, and the answer is yes, constantly. But being scared wasn't the point. The point was whether being scared prevented us from doing what needed to be done. We were trained to fly those missions. We understood why they mattered, and we trusted that the tactics would work if we executed them properly. That combination, training, purpose, and trust, made the fear manageable. Would I do it again, knowing what I know now? Probably not, because I'm old and wise enough to appreciate how many things could have gone wrong. But at 23, with the confidence of youth and the conviction that we were fighting for something that mattered, yes, I'd do it again. Those missions were the most terrifying and most meaningful experience of my life. I'm proud we flew them. I'm grateful we survived them. And I'm glad the technique we helped develop saved lives by giving the Air Force a better way to destroy targets that needed to be destroyed. The legacy of low-altitude bridge bombing extends beyond World War II tactics into fundamental questions about military innovation and adaptation. How do military organizations recognize when existing doctrine has become obsolete? How do they encourage innovative thinking that challenges conventional assumptions? How do they balance the risks of experimental techniques against the costs of continuing failed approaches? The low-altitude bridge campaigns of 1944 provide a case study in successful innovation. Recognition that existing methods weren't working, theoretical development of alternative approaches, careful testing under controlled conditions, operational validation through measured expansion, continuous adaptation based on results and enemy responses, and incorporation of lessons learned into permanent doctrine. These principles remain relevant in contemporary military planning, where technological change and evolving threats require constant tactical adaptation. The specific techniques of low-altitude bombing may be obsolete, but the methodology of innovation they exemplify continues to guide how modern air forces develop responses to new challenges. The bridges destroyed between April and November 1944 stand as testament to what can be accomplished when necessity drives innovation, when courage combines with calculation, and when crews trust that their leadership has provided them the best possible tools and techniques for accomplishing missions that matter. 36 bridges destroyed, 700 miles of railway disrupted, 20 German divisions immobilized for lack of supplies, and all accomplished by heavy bombers flying at altitudes their designers never intended, using tactics that contradicted every principle of strategic bombing doctrine, flown by crews who understood the risks and accepted them because someone had finally found a way to destroy targets that needed destroying. The story of low-altitude bridge bombing is ultimately a story about human adaptability in the face of impossible problems. When high-altitude bombing failed, someone asked why and found an answer in the blind spots of German defensive systems. When that answer required flying enormous bombers at treetop level toward heavily defended targets, crews stepped forward to prove the theory worked in practice. When defenses adapted, tactics evolved to maintain advantage. And when the war ended, the lessons learned became part of institutional knowledge that would guide air warfare for generations. Those lessons echo still in every military organization confronting challenges that established doctrine cannot solve. Question assumptions. Find the gaps. Adapt faster than the enemy. Accept calculated risks when they produce better results than supposedly safer alternatives. And trust that human ingenuity, properly applied, can find solutions to problems that initially appear impossible. These principles, established by B-24 crews flying 50 feet above Balkan rivers in 1944, remain as relevant today as they were 8 decades ago. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.